Okay, everybody. We're going to get started with the panel. So quiet down. Right, before we start, I just want to give a brief introduction to Platypus, who are hosting this panel. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So the U Chicago chapter is hosting this event, and we host a Marxist reading group, which goes over the entire year. And actually, our final session will be on this Sunday from 12:30 to 3:30 p.m. in Harbor 135. We also host coffee breaks, the last of which for this quarter will take place at Hutchinson Commons tomorrow at 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. And finally, we host, in terms of public fora, we host teach-ins, such as we had hosted a teach-in 2 weeks ago on the Black question on the left, as well as panels such as this one, where we host a conversation on the left and are open to all kinds of left perspectives. We also have a publication, the Platypus Review, which you can find in print or online at platypus1917.org. So the title of today's panel is The Anti-War Movement, Past and Present. I'll start by introducing the panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Andy Thayer is the co-founder of the Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism and the Gay Liberation Network, which takes an intersectional approach to organizing, including supporting abortion rights, anti-racist organizing, immigrant rights, and pro-Palestinian and anti-war activism. He has helped organize many large protests in Chicago and is part of the Gay Liberation Network's internationalist activism. He has been arrested at LGBT rights demonstrations in Moscow, Russia, and participated in solidarity delegations to Honduras. Next, we have Josh. Josh is a former anti-imperialist organizer in Oxnard, California, and a former organizer with Tribune of the People, both in Oxnard and Chicago. He is currently a grocery store worker in Chicago and a supporter of the efforts to reconstitute a communist party in the USA, as well as a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. Next, we have Patrick Quinn. Patrick Quinn was the leader of the anti-war movement in Madison, Wisconsin, as well as the head of the Young Socialist Alliance and the Socialist Workers' Party in Madison during the 1960s, and the founder of Solidarity US, a socialist, feminist, anti-racist organization. Finally, we have Gabe Gaster, who was an activist during the Iraq anti-war movement and is currently a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So now I'll read out the panel prompt, which they will be responding to, which is as follows. The Millennial Left began with the Iraq anti-war movement in the 2000s, which was mobilized and led by many Marxist, socialist, and leftist organizations. The ISO, the RTP, Answer, and the new SDS included. Nearly 20 years later, though one has seemingly yet to emerge, a war in Ukraine has prompted calls for a new anti-war movement. However, the conditions of the current Ukraine-Russia conflict are significantly different from those of the Iraq War. Moreover, while the election of Obama seemed to bring an end to the Iraq anti-war movement, the wars continued, leading to Trump's appeal to voters to end the forever wars. This failure of the anti-war movement haunts the left today. How has the left organized opposition to war historically? How is this distinguished from conservative or right-wing opposition to war? What was the significance of the new left Vietnam anti-war movement for the millennials? And what is its significance today? What would it mean to revive the anti-war movement today? What lessons should a new anti-war movement learn from the Iraq anti-war movement? What is the meaning of an anti-war movement for socialists and the goal of socialism? So I guess without further ado, we'll let Andy Thayer speak first. Oh, and people will have, we'll first have opening remarks of 8 to 10 minutes, followed by responses of 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So Andy Thayer, you can speak whenever.
Thank you, and I appreciate people coming out on such a wonderful evening. On a different evening, March 20th, 2003, I had what I consider to be the good fortune to be joining some 10,000 other protesters marching on Lakeshore Drive at the start of the U.S. invasion of Iraq on that night. And this event prompted the single largest mass arrest in Chicago history, which is saying something. Some 900 of us were arrested. The NLG, National Lawyers Guild chapter, filed a class action suit, eventually resulting in what I believe was a $6.5 million suit against judgment against the it was a settlement against the city of Chicago. Basically, every single charge that was against us was dropped in a manner indicative of innocence. The event was seen, I think, at the time, around the country and the world as probably the single most effective nonviolent response to the slaughter that was beginning on that night. And I pointed out, not to puff myself up, but frankly to address some of the questions that are at issue in tonight's forum, because we had a very unique, as I later found out, circumstance in the city of Chicago where all the various left groups that were just discussed, frankly, were not in the driver's seat of this. It was an truly independent citywide coalition, Chicago Committee Against War and Racism, that had formed a week after the U.S. After the World Trade Center bombing, in response to the racism and so forth that was clearly being hyped up in the war fever. In most cities in the United States, one or another left group dominates. It pretends it's the anti-war movement, and if people are kind, they're maybe invited to play bit roles in that. But the whole notion of coalition building seems to be so antithetical to the U.S. left, at least in my experience. This notion of a coalition where there's differing views. Liberals, conservatives, not conservatives, liberals, social democrats, revolutionaries, each having their say, seems to be totally antithetical to the left. And I think, unfortunately, it goes to the left's failure to truly institute democratic centralism in its classic guise in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Because if you look at that revolution, the movement that led up to the October Revolution, there would not have been an October Revolution had there not been true democratic centralism, where minorities within left revolutionary formations could successfully argue and win over the majority to their position. And that's precisely what happened in that revolution. We can't go into it now, but it seems very clear that almost all, if not all, formations that consider themselves revolutionary left in this country feel the urge to purge the moment there is the slightest disagreement on anything. That these are not democratic socialist, democratic centralist organizations. They are one single tendency organizations. And I would argue that makes it very difficult for them to have an effective response. Sure, they can order all their members to jump on cue, but in terms of the kind of flexibility that a dynamic situation requires, they are unable to do it. We put out a call for everyone to basically flood down to Federal Plaza at the start of the war. That's what happened. And because I think we had a tactical as well as strategic flexibility, that's what led that event to be as good as it was. Now, there was, of course, the split between the liberals and the far left. The liberals just wanted to boost Obama. There was an organization then known as Chicagoans Against War in Iraq, notably called that because they weren't against the war in Afghanistan, which they supported. And so that was the split. But they were basically, at least on the night of March 20th, 2003, and for frankly, years afterwards, they were also rans in the movement. It was a true coalition which gave it its strength, which gave that event, I think, its power. Let me move forward to some of the specific questions here. How is the left has organized opposition to war historically? I won't go into that. I'm sure Pat and others will do that. But how is this distinguished from conservative and right-wing opposition to the war? basically between the conservatives and the liberals, you have what I would call the imperial consensus. The United States has got the right and obligation to rule the rest of the world's population, despite having only 4% of the population. It's arrogant in the extreme, I think we can all agree, whereas a revolutionary approach is that the peoples of the world decide their own destinies, and the United States has got no right to determine how other peoples decide their fate. What is the significance of the new left Vietnam anti-war movement for millennials and today? I think it's extremely relevant. The fact of the matter is that a worldwide anti-war movement, where a key portion of it was within the United States military, not just in Southeast Asia, but worldwide, put an end to that war. And one of the things I find particularly appalling about anti-war formations, if you will, today, is that they are completely dismissive or pay no attention to the Russian anti-war movement, because I think that is the key to ending this war. Wars historically have ended in one of three ways: the total obliteration of one side or the other, the mutual obliteration and exhaustion of both sides, or as we saw in the end of World War I, as well as the Vietnam War, people in one of the imperial powers rising up against their masters and forcing them to put an end to the war. This is what happened in Germany in 1918. This was what happened in Russia in 1917. This is what happened in the Vietnam War, in the biggest empire then known to the species. And that, to me, and offering solidarity with the Russian anti-war formation, whereas at the same time pointing out how the United States has been ginning up a proxy war in this circumstance, I think is utterly critical. And I would say that the reason why we don't have an anti-war movement in this country worthy of the name, frankly, is a failure of politics and perspective. And that, I mean, when I hear that a leftist mimicking the notion that Putin invaded Ukraine so as to stop fascism, I've got to say this is about as absurd as thinking that George Bush invaded Iraq so as to bring democracy. I mean, the striking naivete, willful naivete, I think, is just appalling. The fact of the matter is that if we're really about having true liberation, it's got to come from below. It's got to come from the peoples of the world opposing their masters. I'm going to leave it right there and toss it on to my fellow panelists, and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Are the microphones on?
Oh, right. I should have. I think everyone can hear it. Okay. Everyone can hear
Yeah, but what about the video?
Yeah. I think you can. I did forget to tell you guys about it. Yeah, but it should be working. Yeah.
Everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The video should be fine.
Yeah, I think the video will be.
All
fine
right, for
anyway.
sure, for sure.
By the way, at 8 minutes, I'll knock once, and at 10 minutes, I'll knock twice, just to give you an idea of the
All
time.
right, for sure. I mean, well, yeah, this is my first time as a panelist, so I doubt I'll be, reaching the time limit here. But yeah, thank you for having me again. And well, I guess my experience differs greatly from pretty much everyone here. I was a baby when the Iraq War was going on, or just about ending my phases of being in diapers. So I'm coming from this question from a great amount of youth. I'm only 22 years old, so I'm coming at this from my own perspective, and I guess just in response to the question about well, how does an anti-war movement come in the wake of this Obama era? And I was thinking about this at least from my own experience, and being only 8 years old when Obama was elected, and I was raised by middle-class liberal parents in California, and enjoyed a quite comfortable existence, frankly. But obviously, this isn't to discount this era totally, because I think for a lot of people my age, and for a lot of people who are around college age at this time, sort of had those seeds of doubt of, of not just United States foreign policy, but also just capitalism in general. This is a lot of us, grew up in the recession of fearing that our parents would lose their jobs, of slipping into poverty. And I specifically remember, I was about 10 or 11 years old, and the United States' and NATO's invasion of Libya was going underway. And I remember this very well, being in a dentist's office and seeing on CNN. Of course, you would never see this now, for something like what's going on in Somalia right now, or Iraq or Afghanistan. I don't know why they had this, frankly, but they were showing coverage of how, U.S. airstrikes in, I believe it was Tripoli. They were interviewing this little kid, and he was talking about how a bomb struck his house, and how, because of the bomb, like a pipe exploded, and he was covered in boiling water because of it. And I remember at that exact moment, I'm like, wait, this is, the guy who's leading this invasion is the guy that my parents told me was the good guy, in the 2008 election. And I remember, celebrating in the streets because this guy who's doing this to a kid my age was elected. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so that's when that sort of started. And so I think of course, a lot has happened since then. Trump happened, and a lot of other things have happened since. And I think to sort of answer the question broadly speaking of how does this sort of left, whatever you consider the left at this point, how do we respond to the problems of constructing internationalist solidarity with the people who are affected by the wars of the United States and NATO and other imperialist wars all over the world? I think this sort of comes with addressing this fundamental question of how do we sort of unite leftist organizations in the labor movement. Because frankly, I'm not convinced that simply having activism and activist groups without the strong labor movement that is led and struggled under by Marxists, like genuine Marxists outside of, the academy, frankly, I'm not convinced that that's going to be effective without workplace struggles. Something I was thinking about was that, in every country where there has been a revolution, whether this be in Russia with Lenin or with Mao in China, these leaders didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't just come from, reading Marx and reading all these books. They came from struggle, and they came from getting to familiarize themselves with the masses and their problems, and also the daily demands that the masses have. I mean, this shouldn't be that hard in Chicago. I mean, just taking the bus here, the striking difference between where I was at on the Red Line and this neighborhood. It's not that easy it's not that hard to just go over there and see some of the problems that people face. And so I think when people sort of lose their middle class sense of comfort in the left, and really sort of go into the ranks of workers and all oppressed people in this country, and build a genuinely working class movement that's based on propelling forward these struggles. There's been plenty of them, like plenty of strikes that happened in the summer of last year, for example, with the John Deere workers, with Amazon workers right now. There's plenty of that going on. There's plenty of organic and spontaneous energy among the working class in this country to be able to construct solidarity with all sorts of movements, internationalist movements. I think about the fact that in Chicago, I live in Rogers Park. This is a very international working class that we have in the United States, especially in cities like Chicago. And so we have the opportunities right in front of us. But I think that, without leaving the academy in a sense, I think that it's going to be pretty hard for people to construct those movements that can have genuine impact. Because people also, say the word solidarity a lot, I feel like, but that's a lot different from what it used to mean in a lot of sense. What did solidarity really mean beyond just saying the word? I mean, for example, in the Vietnam War, lots of people were fragging their officers. There were 1,000 instances of that where people would literally take the grenades that they were issued and throw it in their officer's tent. Like, that's solidarity with the national liberation movement if I've ever seen one. They're risking their lives for that, excuse me. And, I think there's been a serious decline because there isn't a party in the United States that can lead those struggles. The need for a communist party in the United States is of the utmost important essence to be able to take those daily demands, to take those struggles, across this country, and to carry it forward to where internationalist solidarity can actually mean something, I think. And I think, without that, this sort of energy, whether it comes to the issue of Palestine or Ukraine or any number of imperialist wars that the United States has embarked on or is caused in a number of ways, it sort of dissipates and becomes this very isolated organizing, I think. And this is coming from personal experience from my time as an organizer in Oxnard. Without a sort of strong labor movement, a Marxist-led labor movement where, you take not just the economic struggles, but connect it to the end of capitalism itself. Without that, it becomes very isolated and it becomes a very middle-class centric movement, and that energy gets very dissipated. And I think, so without the sort of unity of these two, it becomes sort of, I guess, like feeling like you're stuck on a treadmill in a certain sense. And so I think that's why the sort of necessity is of genuinely constructing a party in this country that can sort of prepare the work for overthrowing capitalism, and actually doing that, constructing a party that can fight, and turning unions, for example, into fighting organizations. That's going to be the thing that wins people over at the end of the day. So you can say drown imperialism in a sea of resistance, whatever that means, but is it actually connected to something concrete? Or is it just going to be sloganeering? Is it going to be phrase mongering? For example, the Peruvian communist Jose Carlos Mariátegui, for example, when he was constructing, I can't remember the name of the union he established, when he was constructing that, all of the propaganda, all of the slogans he was raising, that was raised on concrete struggles that were, affected by the problems of the day, that were very concretely connected to raising class consciousness. But sort of vague phrases now, I think, are very much the opposite at the moment. So I think that's sort of what I've been thinking about now, a lot, especially since the dissolution of my former organization, Tribune of the People, that, phrase mongering isn't going to be enough, and that we need a party that could connect it to actual working class organizing and change the sort of class composition from this very middle class organizing to actual workers taking leadership. So with that, I think I'm done talking. Who's going to be the next speaker?
Well, the previous two presentations were absolutely excellent, and I think that both speakers made some very good points that will help inform the discussion that will ensue. My job really is to speak about the past, and probably to most people in this room, it's like the ancient past. I look at Josh, and it's hard to believe that I was 22 years old, Josh's age, and during the period that I'm going to talk about. So this is going to give you some indication of how the anti-war movement began in the United States in 1965 It lasted really for only 6 years, from 1965 to 1971, but it was one of the most intense periods in American history. And we started in 1965 without having any previous experience of an anti-war movement. The last movement against a war in the United States was in the period before World War I. When World War I first began in Europe in 1914, there was opposition in the United States from 1914 to 1917, when the United States actually entered the war, and that opposition then ceased and was crushed, and anti-war activists were placed in jail, including one of the leaders of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, that some of you may have heard of. So that was the only experience that we had, and that was a long time ago, between 1914 and 1965. So we had nothing to go on. We had to fashion an anti-war movement, a movement against the war, U.S. war in Vietnam, ourselves. And that's what I'm going to try to tell you about a little bit. And the year was 1965, and the anti-war movement did not begin until the United States began bombing Haiphong, which is a suburb of Hanoi in North Vietnam. And that U.S. bombing of Haiphong, created the impulse for the beginning of the anti-war movement. There had been no anti-war movement prior to that. Even though the United States had been involved in Vietnam and had been fighting in Vietnam going back to President Kennedy's days in 1961, and actually even some of President Eisenhower's activities brought troops to South Vietnam, fighting against the people who were trying to free the country of Vietnam. So there had been a war going on inside of Vietnam, which was the former French Indochina, for quite a number of years before the anti-war movement in the United States began. So once that happened, I was in Madison, Wisconsin. I had graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1964 with a degree in English, and I was enrolled in graduate school in history in 1965 when the anti-war movement began. And it began very, very slowly. In Madison, which I'm going to tell you about because I spent the entirety of the anti-war movement in the United States, which spread throughout the United States, primarily in the northern, eastern, and western part of the United States, but not so much in the South. But during that period, it grew slowly from 1965 to 66, and it wasn't until 1967 that it really began to explode. And so we're talking about the years between 1967 and 1971. 4 years, that's a very short period of time. It's one presidential tenure, so to speak. But during that period, it was one of the most interesting, exciting, and interesting, exciting, and vibrant periods in American history. So what we did in Madison, and I say what we did in Madison because I was there and I had the experience and I was involved in the creation of the anti-war movement and in what it did during the ensuing years between 1965 and 1971. Madison wasn't the only place where the anti-war movement began in the United States. If I would identify three college campuses where the anti-war movement was strongest in the United States, it was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, it was at the University of California in Berkeley, and it was at Columbia University in New York City. Those were the three areas. But by the end of the anti-war movement in 1971, it had spread to thousands of campuses throughout the United States. And there were anti-war organizations on virtually every campus at least in the northern, eastern, and western United States. You had situations like that some of you may be familiar with, like in 1970 at Kent State University in Ohio, where Ohio National Guardsmen shot down and killed members of the anti-war movement who were simply out protesting the war, and the Ohio National Guardsmen shot and killed them. So that was, part of the anti-war movement. It wasn't always seashells and balloons. It was, a difficult period. And we had to start in 1965 with the fact that maybe 98% of the people, the population in the United States, supported the war in Vietnam. So we had a big challenge ahead of us. So what we did at first in 1965, after the U.S. bombing of Haiphong, was to try to gather people who were actually opposed to the war for one reason or another. And we gathered a small coterie of people in Madison. We started out with, maybe I think 10 people, maybe got it up to 25. And there weren't very many, but these were people that all came from various progressive backgrounds. Most of them, what were called later on red diaper babies. Not me, I was just a working class kid from Wisconsin. But a lot of the people who initially got involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam were people of Jewish ancestry, primarily from New York, because at that time New York State didn't have a educational system, so they paid for people to go to places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Berkeley, and other places like that. So at the University of Wisconsin, we had hundreds of kids from New York who were the children. Red diaper babies were the children of people whose parents may have been in the Communist Party or around it or in the Socialist Party. They came from some progressive milieu. And these people really formed the core, the original core of the anti-war movement in Madison. So we started with a small number, and we had to develop a strategy. We didn't know what we were doing. We had to come up with the ideas ourselves. And we decided that Madison was a fairly large city. It had about 276,000 people then. It's much larger now, but that was a pretty large city at that time. And we decided that we really had to do two things. One is that we had to build the anti-war movement on the University of Wisconsin campus among the students, because we thought that the students would be the most receptive to our anti-war message. And then we realized that our major task, which was going to take much longer and would be much more difficult, was winning over the majority of the people in Madison, most of whom were of working class origin. And we knew that was going to be very difficult. We also knew that we had to reach people, young people in between the ages of 18 and the early 20s, who had either had joined the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. We wanted to reach those people as well. And so one of the first things we did is we went, there was at that time no longer, there used to be an Air Force base in Madison, outside of Madison, near the airport, called Truax Field. And that was run by the U.S. Air Force. And the first thing we did there was picket Truax Field, because it was an Air Force base. But at the same time, what we wanted to do is we passed out leaflets to all of the Air Force personnel who exited the gates, to go into town to drink beer or find girls or whatever they did. And we passed out anti-war leaflets with them. And a lot of times they were just ripped up and thrown to the wind. But some people actually read them. And we were able to win one or two, people, who were actually Air Force personnel, and that would continue over the next 6 years, and it would really mushroom by 1971, where we would recruit all kinds of returning combat veterans from Vietnam, or people who were in the various armed services that weren't necessarily in combat. So we decided to have a twofold strategy of building the anti-war movement on campus and building it in the city of Madison, among the working people of Madison. And so we divided our small ranks, which will probably by that time had maybe grown to 25, and split them up half and half. You know, you guys build it on the campus, you guys build it in the city, and so on and so forth. And we began. And not much happened, really, between 1965 and 1967. We grew slowly. It was slowly, and it was very frustrating because we were more hopeful that we could win people over. But it was really in 1967, as the United States became increasingly bogged down in Vietnam, and as combat veterans of Vietnam began returning to campus under the GI Bill, and we were able to reach them, and they knew that war was not a good thing because they had fought there and they had had their comrades killed in Vietnam. 55,000, by the way, were killed there. So we were able to slowly build the movement up, and our ranks grew more and more, and we were delighted by that. And we had more and more people that pass out more and more leaflets and what have you, and we were able to reach more and more people. More and more people were receptive on campus to the anti-war message, and we were beginning to make inroads in the city. And the way we did that was through a fortuitous occurrence that happened. The firefighters in Madison, the firemen, went on strike. Nowadays there's firemen and firewomen, but in those days it was all male. They went on strike, and the whole, both newspapers, all the radio stations, all the television stations came down like a ton of bricks on the firefighters, saying you're facing us in grave danger, that you're going to burn down this city, and you're going to put all you strikers in jail. So what we did is we got 6 packs of beer, we got pizzas, and we went out to every fire station in Madison. I think there are about 26 of them. And we talked to the firefighters and walked their picket lines with them. And that gave us an inroad into the firefighters union that we would have never had before. Probably before the strike, many of the firefighters were pro-war. But by supporting their strike and coming out with 6 packs of beer and pizza and stuff like that, we won them over. And their leader, a guy named Ed Durkin, became opposed to the war and became a leading anti-war activist in Madison.
Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, sorry.
It's already at 14 minutes. Like I think
okay,
it's very fascinating, like this history.
I'll
but
pass it on.
yeah, you can develop it more in like the responses.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I want to talk about, I have 2 basic points. But so first I want to talk about the 5 wars and oppositions to the wars in the last century plus, and I want to kind of compare them. And then, okay, so there's the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the American wars in the Middle East in the early zeros, and the present war in Ukraine. So in World War I, the left was famously split. It was seen at the time as the gravest betrayal when international social democracy capitulated and voted for war. James Joel writes about this very clearly. A line sticks in my head. A French worker says to Jaurès, the leader of French social democracy, "We need you intellectuals because we don't speak German, and we need you to tell them that they're our brothers." But the majority of the trade unions neglected this basic point and voted for war and the destruction of the world. The Bolsheviks advocated a line of dual defeatism, with the imagination that they were immediately on the verge of world revolution. 100,000 German soldiers refused to fight anymore and instead marched armed in Berlin for an end to war and for socialism. With World War II, the left was even more fractured, but basically the left supported the Allies to defeat fascism. I mean, that's basically also kind of shared, common sort of. So the left generally had to support the war. Another maybe interesting but also confusing analogy would be Spain. For there was a left that supported defense of the revolution in Spain, and there was an international legion. And there was a prominent anti-war left in each of these wars, except for the wars against fascism. The Twin Towers fell when I was a sophomore in high school, so that places me somewhere in the middle between the panelists. I was already interested in politics at that point, having campaigned for the Green Party the year before. I registered 9/11 in two ways. In the first, there was the fear and uncertainty on the day itself. It was scary. In the second, there was widespread response to the terrorist attack as an act of war. That night on the news, I remember an interview with a construction worker saying, "I hope they're sending planes there right now." Right, like go bomb them. But like, where was there? We don't know where there, right? But that was the sense, right? So I felt at a critical remove from this like jokes about killing Osama bin Laden in 2001. It just didn't seem right. So I was drawn to the anti-war protests. So I organized a sit-in at my high school and got a bunch of us suspended. I went to many of the big protests that year, including the one that Andy just mentioned. I saw Andy speak, actually, including it was the day of the high school science fair. We took over Lakeshore Drive and walked arm in arm against the police until we got cornered at Oak Street. I spent the night in jail with other protesters before going back to school the next day for a midterm exam. The style of protest, the slogans, the imagination was very much influenced by the 60s anti-war movement. Those years, I went to several protests, was arrested several times, spent a few nights in jail, and then got tired of it. With Vietnam, in the US, there emerged over time a mass anti-war movement. The war did not have mass opposition at its outset, but opposition grew over time. With the wars in the early zeros in the Middle East, the anti-war movement was very well established before the first bombs dropped. A lot was read into that in 2002. The significance of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the zeros was that you could tell a narrative of progress. The narrative was the Vietnam War had to drag on and get more entangled before anti-war sentiment finally built up, But by contrast, the wars in the Middle East, the world had progressed at that time. Europe was done with war because look, there was a European Union. They were done with war, right? We had overcome nationalism, at least in Europe. As further evidence of progress, there were protests of hundreds of thousands of people all over the world when the war was just talked about by George W. Bush. Or before, right? Their narrative was essentially progress. Chomsky gave that interpretation at the time that the developed anti-war movement spoke to the relative development of the international community or something like that. For the left, the significance of the anti-war movement in the zeros was that it was a clear object of critique. There was a place to go to sell newspapers. There was a leadership to criticize. It was at the protest that I encountered the sectarian left, the disbanded International Socialist Organization, which is since disbanded, the SPARC, the PLP, the Progressive Labor Party, the Spartacist League, and the conversations around imperialism and war. At the protests, the focal point was always confrontation with the police. This was supposed to be radicalizing. I grew really dissatisfied with that pattern because it didn't seem to lead anywhere. With Vietnam, there was a story that the left could say. They could say the anti-war sentiment grew and grew and forced the US withdrawal. This story is disputed, of course, but it's nonetheless a dominant narrative. So now is a good moment for us to ask, what happened to the Iraq war movement? The answer in retrospect is clearly the opposite. The anti-war movement started out at its strongest and maybe got a little weaker as the years passed, but what really marks its end is the election of Obama. The war continued right along. The wars even grew in intensity with Obama's troop surge. But there was no surge in the anti-war movement. There was exhaustion and depoliticization. The war continued, and the anti-war movement did not. There were other popular political protests in the last decade, Occupy, BLM, the anti-Trump protests, but the war had receded from view. Eventually, much later, the wars did end, but it really had nothing to do with the anti-war movement, but because the wars were a failure and the US eventually decided to cut and run. The Vietnam Wars culminated in a kind of stagnation on the left. What emerged was a standing army of the left, a late 20th century answer to the standing army of the state, a standing anti-war movement, a permanent peace army that doesn't have to win, it just has to fight. It fights whatever war militarism is on offer at the moment, And that is the real legacy that I encountered in 2002, the politics of resistance. We must resist the war machine is a slogan, and it doesn't get old because the war machine can just continue. So, of course, this legacy itself is a complete perversion of an earlier socialist line on imperialism. Lenin was anti-war in World War I, but a crucial aspect was that he imagined the war ending in a revolutionary overthrow. By contrast, in 2005, I imagined the next anti-war movement, right? The sort of parallel way that the military is anticipating the next war. And that brings me to the founding moment of Platypus, the critique of the anti-war movement. Just past the height of the anti-war movement, on the verge of Obama, I read Moishe Postone, who used to teach here and went to school here, and Fred Halliday in the Platypus reading group. The critique of the anti-war movement from the left really challenged me because it focused on political principle. The original Platypus panel was on anti-imperialism, what it is, and why we should be against it. It was questioning the basic suppositions of the anti-war movement, which was both that the war was an imperialist war for oil and that we should be against it. Platypus chose to focus on the left and insisted on a left-right distinction. What distinguishes left from right oppositions to war? That was actually one of the prompts. In short, the right argues against war on the grounds that 1, the war costs too much, we can't afford it, economic austerity. 2, they're not ready for freedom. Our society's developed for centuries and millennia, learned to become democratic, but they're primitive, and their traditional society does not understand democracy or something, so racism. And 3, we should just mind our own business, isolationism. The left, when it argues against war, does so in principle on the grounds that there are brothers, internationalism, or 2, even if we don't speak the same language, we have a common enemy, the bourgeoisie, class struggle. It's important to draw this up because the anti-war movement in the Zeros took up many right-wing talking points as its own. I think Andy said it was a mix, right? This was the founding critique of Platypus when the left had basically ceded the concept of freedom entirely to the right. The second point of the Platypus critique was historical, to hold up the history of Marxism. The enemies of the US in 1965 were very different than the enemies of the US in 2002. In the 60s, the enemy were communists, who were an international left, like they could see them as their own. In the Zeros, that narrative did not quite hold. Both Saddam Hussein and the Taliban murdered communists, but the line at the time was that the terrorists are the new communists. So there was this swapping. So that was the Platypus point of departure. This war looks very different in many ways than the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the months and years following the September 11th attacks. The most striking difference between the wars is that in one, there was a clear anti-war movement that was mobilizing mass marches before the war began, and there were thousands in the streets of Chicago, hundreds of thousands in the European cities, protesting as the politicians were beginning the drumbeat for war. The protest broke out when I was a sophomore in high school, and I joined them early on. I remember older baby boomers at the protest asking me, why aren't there more young people? Bring your friends. So I organized protests at my school, including a walkout there. Dozens of us got suspended before the bombing started. And I remember Noam Chomsky talking about how it was unprecedented that the anti-war movement had developed such momentum before the bombing started. And I took that as a sign of progress. And I remember thinking that on the one hand, that's an interesting point, okay, there's progress, but on the other hand, we're already too late to stop the war. The question on my mind as a teenager then was, what would it take to stop the next war? And it pointed to the need for a broader organization and made me consider the need for party politics. Of course, then what happened was that rather than continue to grow and develop, the anti-war movement went to sleep with Obama. Obama was elected, and the wars both continued, but the anti-war movement stopped. In a way, the problem I considered as a teenager was a sort of far-sighted problem. How can we best organize the standing anti-war movement? We don't have that problem now. Perhaps that's because the concept of an anti-war movement is itself part of the problem, or not just the politics of the anti-war movement. The mass of the left generally welcomed the war because it gave it something simple to say. Of course, we're against imperialism because imperialism is bad, and this war is for oil. Can we imagine chanting "No blood for oil" now? So the Iraq War seemingly was clarifying for the left, but that belied a deeper confusion that Platypus was founded to interrogate. The anti-war movement could draw on a ready-made theory and a ready-made practice. They invoked Lenin's critique of imperialism and called for mass protests. It's in this way that the left loves war. It gives them something to say, or it used to. The Ukraine war is different. In Ukraine, since an enemy of the US invaded another country, the left has nothing to say. The dominant liberal opinion now is on the side of war. Now Putin seems like the fascist. Of course, everyone thinks everyone else is a fascist and a Nazi, and Trump is thought to be his ally, and so Trump is the fascist, and that would make Bush, by comparison, a defender of democracy. The legacy that now maybe seems more apt is unfortunately that of the 30s and 40s with Franco and the Nazis. There, the left was basically pro-war. The left today basically accepts that there were two good wars in American history, the Civil War and the Second World War. At one point, the left would have also defended the Revolutionary War, but not anymore. The opposition to the Second World War was much more within the currents on the right than on the left. The wars against Franco and the Nazis were good wars because they were anti-fascist. The war in Ukraine marks a shift on the left from basically anti-imperialist politics in the mid-zeros to basically anti-fascist politics today, and that feels very connected, is maybe at the heart of the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America and the collapse of the International Socialist Organization. The anti-imperialist left was more militantly anti-war and supported counterweights to American hegemony. The anti-fascist left saw the counter-American regional hegemons as dangerous, and also was more sympathetic with pro-state politics domestically. So one can't just assume that the left would necessarily have an anti-war position. Is the issue the politics of the anti-war movement, or is the problem the conception of an anti-war movement in the first place? The Spartacist League had a line: the Bolsheviks were the only successful anti-war movement. The Bolsheviks were arguing against the war, but their conception of how to end the war was based upon a much larger political program than just opposition to war. Pure opposition to war is just resistance politics, resisting the war machine. Of course, I want there to be an anti-war movement, but would it be adequate? No. The problem with the concept of an anti-war movement is that it's foundationally opposing a symptom. Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood themselves as addressing a deeper cause. Regardless of whether or not you oppose or support intervention in support of Ukraine or the Russian invasion or oppose it all, there's no deeper cause that we could be addressing here. So what is our world historic mission? Right? That's kind of the first question.
Is that right?
That's it.
That's it. Okay.
It's a bit of an Irish goodbye ending.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for all the speakers' opening remarks. We actually now have like a line of 2 to 3 minute responses. I think we'll start with like the order we went. So Andy.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to address the issue of did the rise of Obama kill the anti-war movement? I think it's being on the ground and seeing how the organizing was going here in Chicago. It obviously played a huge role, but I think it cannot be underestimated and ignored the fact that the anti-war movement was dying before the Obama movement really took off. I mean, there were people that were pushing it, obviously, because he was going to free us, right? But the main problem, frankly, was that the U.S. war was going from strength to strength. Apparently, to people in this country, that the U.S. rolled in, and within a month or two, totally obliterated Saddam Hussein's regime, to the point where George Bush was having his, mission accomplished shit. And you look at all the stuff that's coming out of the Ukraine right now, it's like, boy, wouldn't it have been nice to have some journalists on the other side, showing the other side of that obliteration but there was an unprecedented censorship, and it was a pre-internet age. And so we were not getting those kinds of images and stories. And I will say that the so-called revolutionary left, emphasis on the phrase so-called, played a horrible role in the run-up to the Obama election. People may remember Camp Casey, where anti-war mom who lost her son in the Iraq invasion went down and set herself up outside of George Bush's compound down in where the hell it is in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and drew international attention to the barbarity of the war, at least is recalling the U.S. Soldiers. And just taking the bus down here today, they still have got the blockade in front of Obama's home, even though he's never there. And it was like pulling teeth. We had anti-war demonstrations that went down to Hyde Park here, that attempted to march over to President Obama's house there, and none of the revolutionary left, the so-called revolutionary left, dare join us. They were afraid of being called racist for opposing the same policies that were being pushed by a president who happened to be black. And so I really want to correct the record on that. It wasn't just Obama. Obama was a big problem with all that. When you were saying, Pat, about 98% of the populace supported the war, that sounds so familiar to what we were doing when we were attempting to oppose the Afghanistan war that was beginning. That was apparently on the horizon, and after it began, and it was rough times. It was slow building at best, but I think it was important to be building during that time. It laid the basis for later stuff. Just one last thing, and that's this whole issue of how do we interact with labor unions and so forth. I think it's critical to remember that labor unions are by definition politically heterogeneous organizations. You're going to have right-wingers in them, you're going to have left-wingers in them. It takes an extraordinary time to able to recruit someone to the anti-war movement the way that Pat and his co-thinkers did. But in non-revolutionary times, the notion of a revolutionary leading union, and this is, I think, a problem of much of the organized left, they try and capture positions and say, oh, we've got the teachers union, or we've got SAU now, or whatever, and they ensconce themselves in, as shop stewards or whatever, or worse, higher up, and they become trapped by that bureaucracy. I think it was actually a great thing that Jesse Sharkey decided to go back and become a regular teacher, and there's others of them that have done that before him. I think that was a very honorable and sensible thing to do, because a revolutionary is not going to be able to lead a major union in non-revolutionary times, because unions are by their nature politically heterogeneous. That said, I think some important things have been done in the teachers union. They have come out full bore for defending Roe v. Wade and abortion rights, and supporting undocumented students and so forth, supporting no cops in the schools. Some very important things, but those things are going to have their limitations in terms of what leaders of those organizations are going to be able to do, and I think it become a trap to see the goal as gaining said position. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess to sort of respond to some of what was said here. I think what's been said about with the experience of some pretty much everyone else here that's speaking. The fact is that at the beginning of the wars, especially with Vietnam and Iraq specifically, they did have very high support. But I think one advantage of that should be taken advantage of is that, foreign interventions and, all sorts of wars that are still being continually carried upon by the United States right now have a pretty low support rate among the masses. Even just thinking about conversations that I've had with my coworkers, and at jobs that I've previously held in California, none of them really have faith in this system, that it can sort of, that wars or interventions can actually help them. And obviously that's not to say that itself is revolutionary consciousness, but the fact is that especially now, in this post-Trump era, especially with all the economic problems that have been facing huge sections of the working class, I think people have very little faith in the government at the moment. I think that the faith is sort of waning. I think that as much as you can call it cringe or whatever, the Let's Go Brandon stuff or talking about inflation, it is genuinely positive in some senses, where it's I've had coworkers who, or like I've met like workers who have, they may hold some right-wing opinions, but the fact is that they don't like necessarily see their aspirations continually to be in the system of capitalism, of imperialism. And, of course you're going to get like was sort of what was said, like, for example, with the question of unions, of course you are going to have like politically heterogeneous people. That's just any country you go to, the entirety of the population is going to have, progressive people and reactionary people and people all sorts of in intermediate positions or whatever. That's any revolutionary situation you're going to be, facing up against that. And the goal is, of course, to win over all spectrum of people within that. And I guess just to clarify my stance, like on sort of unions, I guess like to sort of clarify, I'm not necessarily for the position of entering just unions for the sake of entering unions. Of course, like my both of my parents growing up are teachers, and they're in the California teachers unions. And there's a lot of problems with the teachers unions out in California. For example, not agreeing to strikes, basically bowing to the will of superintendents in their districts. There's obviously problems with these sort of sellout bureaucrats that make up a lot of the unions. And of course, entry into that without some sort of organization linking, the fights that each of those unions are going to have without some sort of actual united front, it is going to be like you're on a treadmill to a certain extent, where, like you were just saying, you can become a shop steward or, this and that. But if that's not connected to something, if that's not connected to a party of the working class, by the working class, with working class leadership, a communist party in this country, a genuinely communist party, we're going to be like hamsters on a wheel here. I guess that's all I have to say at the moment. I'm sure I forgot plenty of things. So, with that.
Wow, how do you follow up those presentations? They're really quite good, and people are posing some very good questions to speak of. My apologies for going a bit beyond my allotted time in my presentation. One thing to keep in mind: why the war in Vietnam and the movement against the war in Vietnam was so different than anti-war movements that followed it is very simple. This was a war that the United States was involved in. It permeated every sector of the United States. Hundreds of thousands of young people, young males primarily, of course, were drafted and sent to Vietnam, and thousands upon thousands of them were killed. Yeah, it's true that there was some fragging. It was primarily, privates and who were fragging officers, because officers were telling them what to do. They hated the officers anyway. These were smart-ass guys who were from ROTC or maybe even West Point. So it wasn't too difficult to chuck a hand grenade there. That did happen, and there was a great deal of opposition to the war among American GIs in Vietnam, particularly as the war continued year after year, and the opposition to the war within the Army, within the armed forces. All of the armed forces continued to increase. The question of unions is a very difficult question. It's a very uneven question. Not only was I involved in the anti-war movement in Madison, I was also involved in the union movement. I was a member of the executive board of AFSCME Local 1, which is the first American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees locals in the United States. And I was a member, I was a delegate to the Medicine Federation of Labor. And I was also later on a member of American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 171, which was the largest union in the state of Wisconsin. We had 6,000 members. It was based at the University of Wisconsin. Now, I hate to tell you this, but there are only 232 members because the Republican Party, really trashed the union movement in the state of Wisconsin, where I presently live. But what we got to do is take a look and get a better appreciation of what goes on and why it goes on through the Marxist notion of material reality. Material reality tells you what is actually going on, and that's how you can interpret what happened, how the war, the movement against the war in Vietnam came about, and why things didn't really necessarily happen on the same scale as in the movement against the war in Iraq, and now it's a different kind of situation. It's as though we're in a movie theater and we watch, the Ukrainians and the Russians. This is not our story.
It's a proxy war.
Yeah, it's something we watch on television, and we see Zelensky go on there, and we see Putin, and it's a very complicated thing. The Ukrainian troops that surrendered in Mariupol, most recently the Azov battalion, were all pretty damn close to being fascists. They were extreme right-wingers in the Ukrainian army. They were so the situation is very, very difficult going on now, and it's almost impossible to draw parallels between what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and the anti-war movement in 1965, the movement against the war in Iraq, and so on and so forth. There's not a correlation there at all. So that's why I say material reality really helps color the situation. And since I did go way over my time, I'm going to pass to the microphone back and for other people to talk.
So I want to go back to the legacy of the anti-war movement, for the anti-Iraq war movement. Because I spent a few nights in jail, part of a few class action lawsuits against Chicago and New York. 10 years later, got paid money in the mail. Long after that stuff. I mean, the war was still going actually, but the war, right? The anti-war movement had stopped, but the war was. But I got a check in the mail, and then what's the legacy of that? What was the effect? And actually, I remember in the protests, the Occupy protests in Chicago, they did mass arrests there too, but they warned everybody before they were going to arrest them. You have to disperse, otherwise you're going to get arrested, and then they arrested everybody. And so that was to me, that was a clear moment, in the mid 2016 or 2012, 2013. It's oh yeah, that's the legacy of my arrest, was that the police are now just going to announce that they're going to arrest you before they arrest you, and then they do. And so those are the things, I accomplished something. What I accomplished was the police made the announcement that they were going to arrest you before they arrest you. And my rights were violated or whatever, and that was bad, but what are we left with? I mean, I totally agree that the anti-Iraq war movement was definitely waning before Obama. That was just the kind of crystallized moment where, for me, I mean, I remember going downtown to watch the Obama's address to the nation when he was elected, and just what that moment was like, and yeah. There was, and also I was part of the new SDS movement, which was had a plan to protest whoever was going to be elected It was like that was the initial thing. It was like there's going to be a protest the first 100 days after the election in November, no matter who's elected. And then that basically just kind of collapsed too when Obama won. So
They supported him.
right, and so I guess I don't think that the anti-war movement can just be said to like have collapsed because the war was successful. I mean, okay, maybe it wasn't as extreme as Vietnam, but I don't think that that's really an adequate explanation for it. I think that there's something else, and I think that actually like the legacy of it is what we have right now, which is like no anti-war movement. more likely.
Okay, thanks for all the panelists for your opening remarks and responses. Now we're actually going to open the floor to questions. Like you can raise your hand if anybody has a question. Actually, you might bring a mic. Do you mind passing the other mic? Yeah, thank you. And then we'll pass the mic to you. So, yeah.
Thanks for those presentations. I'm going to try to pull some threads together from what has been said. I think that in the opening presentation, Andy said that there was a failure of politics and perspective, right? And you brought up the absence of the support for voices of anti-war in Russia, right? Like, why is that not even a priority? Why aren't people really talking about that? There's kind of a collapse of politics and perspective. And I wanted to maybe tap into the history that Patrick has been talking about. You said that before the New Left, there was just the pre-World War I anti-war movement, and that was the only image of anti-war politics that you had in your historical memory. And I wanted to know, how did the politics and perspective of the New Left anti-Vietnam War movement differ from that pre-World War I movement? So it seems to me that some of the things that have been brought up by Gabe in his presentation about the Bolsheviks and Lenin's opposition to the war, the slogan at the time was turn the world war into a civil war, right? Oppose the regime at home. And that was not because you hated the officers, because you wanted to kill the authority, but rather it was because you wanted to build a revolutionary movement to overcome capitalism. And so was that present at all in the New Left? And how did you deal with the different horizons of possibility? Because clearly we're still in capitalism. So did the anti-war movement just sought to end the war? Or did it seek to do something else like the pre-World War I movement did? And if that's not the case, like, what is its legacy today?
If I could respond to that, I think you asked some very good questions. There was a great deal of difference between the movement against the war in 1914, between 14 and 17, and 1965-71. And really what happened in the period before the First World, the United States entered the First World War, is that war, anti-war movement collapsed once the United States declared war and began sending troops over to Europe. At the same time, the United States government jailed all opponents of the war, including Eugene Debs, who was the leader of the Socialist Party. He put him in the U.S. prison in Atlanta for the duration of the war. So that happened, and that was a fundamental difference than what happened much later. I don't know. Somebody else might want to speak to it.
I think too, like, and I'm not claiming to be an expert on this history by any means. My parents weren't even alive at the time, but you had potential for those sort of those things to to sort of be unified at the time too, with the beginning of the Revolutionary Communist Party at the time. Of course, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, is now sort of a joke. I'm sure you guys have walked around and see join the Revcoms and Bob Avakian this and Bob Avakian that. They love talking about their glorious leader, Bob Avakian. But for a while, there was genuine potential at the time because, this was an organization that did come from the New Left in '65 and that era. And, you had the potential for them because, a lot of this was, this is the Bay Area in California. And you had a lot of the leaders who would eventually form this organization, being involved in what was the anti-war movement. But then they also got involved into some of the strikes that were happening at the time. For example, oil workers in Richmond, were joined by RCP members. And I can't remember the year. It might have been 1969. I could be wrong. But that was a good example of when, you had these like anti-war, a lot of college students, joining the ranks of the working class in their daily struggles for the daily demands that they were fighting for, their economic demands. And, sowing the seeds for there to be this unity of we want the war to end, but we also want capitalism here to be overthrown at some point. However, you had, as I can't remember who said this, but this sort of instinct to immediately purge, any sort of dissidents within this party, that it's, excuse me, that instinct sort of kicked in, and people who wanted to have this unity of the working class and all these various international struggles was sort of they were kicked out, and instead we had this emphasis in this organization, the RCP, on propaganda. So instead of joining workers for strikes and for internationalist action, you had wear a button day you would wear like a button of Mao. This is like absurd, and this is sort of like part of the beginning of the end of their party as an actual force for the left. And but there was the potential there, genuinely.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back. I think it's very important, the whole issue of the lack of support or apparent support for anti-war voices in Russia. And I think, for one thing, that's a failure of the organized left. I spoke at a protest that was organized by Code Pink in front of Quigley's office a couple months ago, and while the war was already raging. And I pointed out that our true allies were not, as I put it, bastards like Quigley, but actually the anti-war activists who are risking far more than anyone in this country are to do what they were doing to oppose that war. And it got a fantastic response. This was students from DePaul mainly, Code Pink. They were, liberals, maybe social democratic leaning, but not terribly defined politics. It's a failure of the organized left, the old left, if you will, not of, I think, where a lot of people instantly recognized and identified with, for example, that young woman producer who, basically threw away her career by coming out anti-war on Russian national television.
Holding up the...
Correct. And so, a lot of it is, frankly, the legacy of what I would call Stalinism and neo-Stalinism, including Trotskyist variants of it, weighs heavily on the U.S. left. Stalinism was the dominant Maoism, the Maoist variant of Stalinism was the dominant force within the new left, as Patrick can attest, I'm sure. And not only did that make those parties basically poison to any of us who are LGBTQ, for example, and the sort of very macho Neanderthal, misogynist. Again, there was it wasn't one movement because of those horrible politics that so much of the people who called themselves revolutionaries espoused. what I see now is really a failure of imagination of those sections of the left, the old left, because I was really struck when Pat talked about how the Vietnam War permeated U.S. society. I think that's very, very important in a way that the video game wars subsequently that we've seen in this century have not. You can bet that the war is permeating every section of Russian society today. And if there's going to be a powerful anti-war movement, once it can break through the horrible state repression, because this war isn't going anywhere fast, as we can tell. The privations that the Russian people have been put under by this war, by the U.S. sanctions, which, by the way, makes it despicable, the fact that many liberals support those sanctions, because they're hurting our side. They're not going to hurt Putin at all. They're hurting Russian working class people. The last thing is, Gabe, I really needed to respond on the whole notion that we accomplished nothing. I'll tell you, I was arrested more times than I can count subsequent to March 20th, 2003 for simply attempting to assemble. And what that lawsuit, which I couldn't be part of because I was seen as one of the bad people that organized the protest.
They probably arrested you first, actually.
Actually, I lasted pretty long, but I kept to the center of the crowd at the end during the kettling. But they targeted all the organizers. Anyway, long story short, the fact is that we had a running battle every single year for simply the right to assemble. And we fought those battles. We jumped through the damned hoops. Every single year, on or about March 20th, we would do those and we would fight those sometimes ridiculous battles. We fought some of the same battles in the run-up to 2012 NATO. And I think it was an important battle to fight because we were exposing the fact that they don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in the First Amendment. They don't believe in the right to assembly. And that's what we were pointing on, and we got a lot of mileage out of it. It was a pain in the ass. I learned more about Chicago City ordinances than anyone should ever have to. But I should point out that then other people moved on from there. The Laquan McDonald protests after the release of the video showing the police murder of that young man have wiped away and made a dead letter of Ordinance 10-330-10, or whatever the fuck it is that I've been charged with more times than I count. Anyone that's got any kind of brain in this town no longer applies for a parade permit. If you got the forces, you take the street. And I will tell you that that has been a decades-long battle, of which those early anti-war protests were a part of, an honorable part of. And thank you to the black youth who finally got rid of these crappy ordinances and made them a dead letter. Because I'll tell you, people in New York who look at the way that we just take the street when we've got the forces to do it, they're fucking jealous, and they should be.
So,
Sorry.
No worries.
right, I mean, yeah, there's still people that are protesting. There's still more things to protest, but I don't know about the effect on the war, or the effect on the next war, or, I mean, if you think about the war, the U.S. is not directly involved, but it's clearly like indirectly it's directly supporting Ukraine, and it's a proxy. Sure, it's popular, really popular, and it's popular on the left too, and so the left doesn't really like have much to say about the war. I mean, like, what is the DSA saying about the war?
They spoke at that same protest that I was at.
And what
and opposing U.S. arming of Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay, but I think that the is that a majority tendency in the DSA? It's like
No.
It's like a fringe, right? I mean, I think basically most of the like liberal opinion and like left opinion is generally in support of the war, And okay, there are people who are against the war. There's like, there are groups of people in that.
War in support of Ukraine.
Right, but like there's no anti-war movement.
Correct.
And that doesn't exist. And so we can have protests, but they could be directed towards ultimately, taking over the street, confronting the police, but that feels very limited without a broader program or, that they are really trying to achieve. It's just a kind of a question of resistance at that point. I wanted to say something else about, you mentioned video game wars. And there is this like sense, and I think in the early 2000s it was like, I remember watching it on TV, like they were like, oh yeah, like tanks. This is like, and it was done by, this was like military, news in the US. It was like, yeah, tanks, like we don't need tanks anymore. This is like a clear waste of, like we can have a more like trim economic budget. Like tanks are a total waste because like, look, they didn't even really work in Vietnam and they didn't really like do much in the Gulf War, and those days are done because now we're just gonna like do bombing. And like what's interesting now is like this war in Europe, right? The war in Europe feels like very old-fashioned. It's like a trench war. And like my friend, my coworker, quit his job. He was an Iraq war and Afghanistan war. He did like several tours. He quit his job to go fight, to go volunteer for the International Legion. He's like in a trench in Ukraine. And there's mines. It's just it just feels very like, it just feels very different than like the whole imagination of 10 years ago. And that's, like the world really feels like a very different place now than it was 10 years ago. And it feels like the left, the extent to which it's against the war is still kind of like in this like 10 years ago place. Still like in this like vestigial, like, and another way of saying that is like, okay, there's like this anti-fascist and anti-imperialist like separate tendencies on the left, and the extent to which people are anti-war today, there's still like anti-imperialist, and that's very much like not of this moment, it feels like.
I don't know. I kind of
wait. Just sorry.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly. That was just to say. Yeah.
I don't know. I sort of wanted to disagree with the notion that like people are sort of broadly for this war. I think like one major thing that we could sort of differentiate this between like, this conflict, this proxy war that's going on in the Iraq war is that like, with, I'm sure as you well remember, like Bush's approval rating skyrocketed,
Sure.
In that era. Like it was, like it was ironically like Saddam Hussein fake poll numbers, like, but I think with now we don't really see that. I think that like, we have some sort of astroturfed, like, people posting on their Instagram story, very infographic support of, this vague notion of support Ukraine, whatever that may be. There's no sort of concrete policy. Some people may support a no-fly zone. Some people may even say, you know what, just nuke Moscow. Like it could be,
Sure.
It could be like anything. It's not like the Iraq war where there's, a unified call to invade Iraq. There is, huge support for the government policy there, because I've seen more people say, well, why are they giving $30 billion to this, decrepit, state when, I don't even have money for groceries right now. Mm-hmm. I'm just about run out on my EBT card. Like, I see that way more, especially off social media, like with my coworkers, with the working class people that I know and speak to. I see that way more than just, let's go and bomb the hell out of them like it may have been in 2003. I just feel like, there is a different situation where it is like, like people sort of see the decrepitude of the American state at the moment. And I think that is like a genuinely good thing. And I think as far as like, you talk about like the state of the left and sort of responding to this question, but frankly, like most people don't care. about like these organizations. Like, most people do not care about what the PLP has to say about Ukraine. I go on their Instagram, their posts are getting like 10 likes sometimes. I'm like, this is not like most of these organizations are not like relevant. Like, a lot of them are pretty, left to the 60s essentially, or, are sort of, they don't really have a mass appeal. And so it's like, in a lot of cases, it's like, okay, we can talk about the left and the reaction among the left, but who cares? Like, to a certain extent, like a lot of these just simply do not have relevance with working class people. So that's how I wanted to respond to some of your points.
Hello. I just want to say something, Josh. You said like working class people might be discontented with like the war and inflation. Why the hell are we sending weapons? But nonetheless, there's no anti-war movement, right?
Right.
Or like seemingly there's no anti-war movement, even with this discontent. Just food for thought.
And
you don't have to respond to that.
Oh no, and I did want to respond just sort of briefly, and then I'll pass back the mic. But sort of like, I guess it's to me it's sort of similar in that, like, for example, the majority of Americans do not vote. The majority of Americans, I mean, rightly so, they don't vote, and they don't have faith in the electoral system. And I think it's a sort of very similar problem where it's like, there already is this discontent. There already is, the fact that people just do not have faith in this system, broadly speaking, in one way or another. This may appear for various reasons, and, that itself isn't revolutionary, but it's fertile ground for revolutionary thought and action and organizing at the end of the day. And so I think that, we have, or like whatever that may mean for the left, has an advantage there. So.
Any other questions?
Sorry for sweating up the mic. My hands are so sweaty.
I'm going to swap batteries while I ask this question.
Should I hold the mic?
Yeah, sure. So I did some homework before this panel, and I read the transcript of a panel from 2010 that Platypus also did about imperialism. And one of the top, so they were directly speaking about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan at that point. So instead of talking about 2003 and 2005, I'll mention like 1992 for a second, which is kind of interesting that it's not brought up in regard to like Ukraine. So on that panel, a lot of people bring up the war in Yugoslavia, about the confusion among the left at that period of time, that there was all these kind of like confusion as like what side to take. There was notably a lot of leftists who openly supported Slobodan Milosevic.
Stalinism.
So there's that.
Banker.
In many ways, this conflict, aside from the fact that it's not a civil war, does seem more akin to the situation in Yugoslavia as opposed to actually the one in 2003. What's the significance of that historical memory not actually being something that's actually brought up in open discourse now regarding Ukraine? Why is it that you actually don't hear about the left's response to Yugoslavia within the left today? What does the war in Yugoslavia and the left's response then actually inform us about the present?
The answer to your question is in two words. Who cares? That's what the vast majority of the American people who watch this stuff on TV say about what went on in Yugoslavia and even what's going on in Ukraine now. It's not us. It's not happening to us. The United States, while it's giving $30 billion or so, to the Ukrainians, it is not there in reality. There are not thousands and thousands of American soldiers involved who would have ties throughout the United States. So there's not the material reality for the same kind of interest, so to speak, or our concern, if you want to use that term, that you had in previous incarnations, whether it was the Civil War, World War II, you know, you had one war that people haven't mentioned, the Korean War. And there was no opposition to the Korean War because the Korean War, you know, rested on the legacy that the United States had won in World War II by defeating Nazi Germany. And so Korea was, well, that was someplace out over there, you know, out of sight, out of mind. And that's the situation. That the material, that's why I asked the question of material reality. How does it affect, you know, everybody in this room? You know, and that's why I call it a TV war, that you turn on the TV, the CNN or to ABC, CBS, so on and so forth. In the back there.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
Well, I mean, why don't we let him and we can do a wrap up after. Go, yeah.
Nobody in this room is involved or cares.
Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Okay. Okay. To the question, nobody in this room cares. We're not involved. Like during the Vietnam War, there was a draft. The Iraq War, there was no draft. It was volunteers, a lot of people, and they came back, etc. But now, in my view, more significant than what is going on the ground in Ukraine, with horrors that are happening, I completely outraged by it. But the economic war is global. It's happening now. The economic war is already, for some of us, we still are not aware, but in 6 months we all will be very aware when shortages hit even this country, mostly Europe, definitely first the weak countries in Africa, in South Asia, even as we speak. Sri Lanka, a small country, very few people even care, but they know, well, they look like Indians or whatever. Sri Lanka, civil society is breaking down. I watched last night how mobs going to the houses of politicians, and nobody said what politicians.
Good for them.
Right? No, none of the above. All of the
two
above.
brothers.
They were going to the politicians, pulling them out of their cars. They were trying to run away, beating them up with clubs, crowds, and then taking their cars and dumping them into the nearest waterway. That is happening now. What I'm saying is, with shortages and famine that is expected, and no, it's not Putin's, what do you call it, problem. It's everybody's problem, and it is initiated right in this country by the Democrats with active participation with almost all Republicans. When they passed it, it was 40 billion. Biden wanted 33, and the Democrats threw 7 billion more. What's the problem? Why not throw more into it? To buy not food, not medicines, more powerful weapons to kill more Russians. But for every Russian killed, there's at least 10 Ukrainians or more. The whole thing is insanity. People figured it out before World War I. How insane this, who is getting killed on those fields? Mostly common people. So to talk about it, oh, we have to stand with Ukraine. It's idiocy. Standing with Ukraine is to stop the war, and you don't stop the war by pouring 40 billion more, astounding amounts of money, and then to consider this is all just the Russians doing. For years we knew, not only knew, the activities by special forces, American forces, in uniform or not uniform, were actively training the Nazis. Mariupol was a bastion of the Nazis, which just now was finished. It doesn't make the people fighting the Russian or Putin any better for doing what they're doing. But the reality is, we, the United States, is throwing more weapons to those Nazis who are losing. Ukraine is basically over in terms of their thing. Whatever the results, how the country will be divided, I don't know. But Europe will be flooded with weaponry of all kinds, some very sophisticated, by criminal gangs, because most of the money is going to criminal gangs, Russians and Ukrainians, and of all other nationalities, Europeans or not. That is what is facing us. And yes, we are all sooner or later be affected by this, whether we want to look at it or not. The reason I'm talking about it is that is the least discussed. The sanctions. The sanctions in economic warfare has been going on way before Putin did whatever he did. And the idiocy, the suicidal aspect of it is not even mentioned, left or right. And I think for leftists, care for common people, that is number one. It's about the economy. What is going on here? It's not blood for oil. It's about enriching very few people in this country, in Russia, and somewhere else in the world of whatever nationality. That's all it's doing. It's laundering money, and we know it's not going to any people anywhere for any good. I'll stop here, I'm sorry. More time if I need it.
I think it's time to wrap this up.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to bring it back to the left and just kind of, Josh, you said, like, people don't care about the left. Yeah, the left is dead. But Platypus thinks that it ought to exist. And so one of the things I think that you're talking about that was discovered before the World War I, right, was that it is a connected war. It's a global problem, hence the international, hence turning the war into a civil war. So what do we make of that slogan? Like, what do we make of those lessons of being anti-war before the collapse in the 20th century of the left? Have we forgotten it? Because it seems to me, Josh, that one of the ways in which we people in a room that have the time and freedom to speak to each other about history and the great questions of what are we to do is this our responsibility to sustain that consciousness and to think about what those questions are. Meaning there's social discontent right now, but it's not directed against capitalism. So I guess, like, given that we're in this room together, right, like, I just want to know, what should the left do? Like, what do you all think should be the left today? What should it do? What should its position be?
I guess just to quickly respond, because we don't have that much time, just to, I guess, wrap this question up. I think, yeah, just like my response to that, like, in terms of what, like, the left would do is, I don't know, people should get jobs. Frankly, a lot of us are students on the left. We should leave the academy to an extent, obviously get your degrees, but, like, revolutions were not born in journals, essentially.
Mariátegui was an intellectual,
Who was?
Mariátegui was an intellectual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mariátegui was an intellectual, and of course many of the other intellectuals that did found it, like Marx, Engels, etc. They were middle class intellectuals, but they had strong ties to the people. They had strong experiences with the daily struggles that the masses faced. And I think that, reading, I've been reading a book by, he was like he was a leftist within the Communist Party before it, dissolved and whatnot. His name was William F. Dunn. What he was talking about was that the left should embed itself in all the issues, both domestically and internationally, that affect the masses. To sort of, I guess, like, summarize that, like, there needs to be, like, a left within the working class itself, not this very middle class oriented left that is sort of the default at the moment. That has been the default since the liquidation of the Communist Party in this country, which happened, in the 1940s with, what was his name? Browder was his name. So I think sort of, that's a process that would take years. No communist party in this country or in the world, was just, like the snap of a finger just formed. But there has to be one actually based in the working class itself and their struggles to sort of be a force that can respond to those problems internationally. I feel like I've been repeating myself for a bit, but I think that's a response. And I think, just, and get yourself out there essentially. Know your coworkers, live with, work with, and struggle with the masses, as the communists in China said back in the 60s, would be how I would approach it. Does anyone?
Well, I want to say, talking about Yugoslavia, the economic war, popular discontent. Yeah, I think there's a lot of working class discontent. I think people do care about Ukraine and care about international politics, and they also care about, economic politics domestically. And the role of the left is to try to help the working class understand its own interests, and make a revolution. But that doesn't really seem very proximate right now. That's true. But there's still popular discontent. I mean, what I was trying to talk about with my talk was like, I think that the history of Marxism is important. And I think that one of the things that one of the common threads was like, there's this high watermark in the 60s that we can look towards. But then what does that really say, both about progress since then and also about the 60s itself? And so we're in this moment now, which is different than it was 10 years ago, I think. There's a shift, there's been a historical shift, and that is very confusing for the left. And I think that the left matters, because I think that the left is crucial for the future of humanity.
I'd like to address the issue of why aren't people out in the streets? We live in one of the most atomized society, and if the pandemic, the responses to the pandemic tell us anything in this country, we live in an extremely atomized society. You look at the level of drug overdoses, literally a third or more of the country going crazy following QAnon nonsense and so forth. There's any number of indications of just how extremely atomized and powerless the vast majority of working class people feel in this country. They don't feel that they can control their block, let alone what the fuck people in DC do, especially living, hundreds and hundreds of miles away here in Chicago. I mean, DC might as well be Pluto, I think, as far as a lot of working class people, at least in Chicago, feel in terms of their ability to affect what goes on with the war or not. That's just a reality. And I was searching here online when I talked about when the war seemed to be going all their way. In November 2006, an anti-war activist, an artist and so forth, by the name of Malachi Richter, immolated himself at the junction, at the Ohio feeder ramp by the Kennedy Expressway. His frustration was a protest against the war. And he expressed what a lot of us felt at the time, that these bastards in DC are getting away with bombing and obliterating countless numbers of people, and we're powerless to stop it. I mean, you can march on Lakeshore Drive, you can march on wherever, but that isn't social power. Social power is being able to shut down the armaments shipments and so forth because you have a mass labor. We were so far away from that, and yet we felt we had to do something. And so quixotic things like taking a pair of felony counts for trying to block George Bush's motorcade in 2007, I believe it was. And I only got off of it because thanks to Department of Homeland Security videotape that showed me that I did not assault that cop. But that was the level of frustration. 6 of us doing that action because the bastard was coming to town again, and it seemed no one was opposing him in spite of pushing this slaughter. So even before Obama took office, there was an immense level of frustration, and I think it's a lot of frustration that working class people share in this country. That said, I think we have an enormous opportunity right now, if not on the anti-war front, on the Supreme Court front, because people are waking up to the fact that this Supreme Court may be the first court that is proactively taking away what had previously been constitutionally guaranteed rights, not just from people who might bear children, but from LGBTs, even interracial marriage and so forth. And I'm happy to say that some 5,000 plus people came out last Saturday in Union Park and marched downtown, and a much younger and more militant group did the same thing the previous Saturday. And so this is where I go into my propaganda mode, because I'm going to get you guys to pass these around the room, and I want everyone to take them. 5:30 p.m., the day the bastards announce their decision, we're asking people to go down to Federal Plaza, 5:30 p.m. that day, whichever day it is. It's probably going to be probably the latter half of June, but we can't count on that. We need to, it was very interesting, the court in there, Alito in his stupid draft. Oh, I can't get this effing thing up here. Bear with me a second. It had a very telling statement in it. We do not pretend to know how our political system or society will respond to today's decision overturning Roe and Casey. It's up to us to show that society is fucking outraged. And if they ignore our voices, they ignore our sentiments, they're going to have to ignore our bodies. That was the line by which we took Lakeshore Drive on March 20th, 2003. They've ignored our voices, the overwhelming sentiment of people who opposed that invasion, not just in this country, but around the world, and now they're going to have to oppose our bodies. It may not be stopping armaments going to Ukraine and every other U.S. proxy war around the world, but it's a start. And I think we have to start where we're at. Right now is there are millions of people who are totally pissed off at this court. This court has lost all the legitimacy it might have had in rapid fashion. And I think it's a huge opportunity for those who want to build a revolutionary left to connect with that sentiment that this court, that national government institutions are irrevocably discredited, and we need to push that for all it's worth.
I think we should wrap on that. I think that's a pretty good way to end this presentation.
Actually, I did want to, you can give your closing remarks now. You can decide how long you want to give them. It's usually 3 to 5 minutes. But I actually want to return to a question, and this will be you can answer this as part of your closing remarks. That was originally part of the panel prompt. Namely, what would it mean to revive the anti-war movement today? And what is the meaning of an anti-war movement for socialists and the goal of socialism? So yeah, you guys can just wrap up. I think you can go in the order that you originally spoke in. So Andy, then Josh, then Patrick, and Gabe. And yeah.
I'll be quick. what would it mean? We've got to break the imperial consensus, which is that the United States has got the right to rule other people's lives around the globe. That is the critical, and I think a lot of people are ready for it. I think we can make arguments about immigrants have the right to be here after the United States has screwed over their countries, has installed dictators, has launched wars, and now has got climate catastrophe driving people from the South, for example. I think that the combination of the economic situation that many working class people face is both a danger as well as an opportunity. During the run-up to the anti-war movement in Vietnam, you had the post-World War II boom, which had treated a lot of working class people better than they ever could have imagined during the Great Depression and so forth. Today, we've got a declining empire which is trying to control the world and is hitting working class living standards and benefits over and over and over again. And I made this sort of remarks at an abortion rights demonstration down at Federal Plaza several weeks ago that it's not just abortion that we lack, it's every single social service that other advanced societies economically take for granted. It's because we fund, we have a military that's greater than the next 10 militaries combined.
Yeah, I'll also be quick. I guess just, I was thinking about, and I don't think this had been brought up in terms of sort of popular protests in this country, but I think we do need to learn a lot of lessons as well from what happened in 2020 with the May uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. The fact is that like people are willing to rebel in this country. I wasn't in Chicago when that happened. I was back in California, but like a real anti-war movement, that's connected to a party that can, carry forward the aims of anti-imperialism, actually consistently anti-imperialism, not just, anti-America, but imperialism everywhere. That hopefully will make 2020 look like a warm-up, because 2020 was crazy, but I mean, there's been more. Like the 60s happened, and hopefully the 60s will be sort of seen as a prelude to what could potentially happen in this country. So yeah, just I guess the slow work of constructing a working class movement that actually responds to the needs of internationalism, of basic solidarity. It's slow and it will take years, but more's happened in the past. Crazier things have happened, I guess. Is all I can say at the moment.
We shouldn't be upset because there is no anti-war movement here today. There is no anti-war movement because the United States is not involved overtly in a war that permeates the entire, society. So, it's understandable why there isn't any anti-war movement. But there are a host of problems out there, and I think all of us are aware of them to one degree or another. And there has to be some way of combating those. Some of those are mass demonstrations or even a small demonstration. Sometimes it takes political form. There are organizations such as the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, which is for socialism and not capitalism. And that's an option at this point. Yeah, the history of the left over the past century really began in 1917 in Russia, and it extended all the way through 1989 when it ended. And we're in a new era now, a new situation. And there are not the material reality of a mass happening that would generate a movement against all of these ills which beset us. And that's part of the problem. That's why we all feel a certain sense of frustration here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a generation that's passed now since Yugoslavia, 92, 89, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Marxism and has a different, and socialism is very different. I think, like, as a young people don't have the same memory of the Cold War today that they did, and that has a real political effect, sort of, except there's still not really independent working class politics, and that's kind of what you would need for any of this stuff to matter politically. So, there's maybe a new kind of openness among, like today, towards the concept of socialism, except there's not independent working class politics. It's just basically tied to the Democratic Party largely, if not entirely. So that's a problem. That's the problem.
Sure. Okay, a big thank you for all our panelists, and I think we give them a round of applause.